Okay, so I chose to stop the recording and do two parts just because it was getting too long, and I thought, well, this is a good place to stop. Um, Before, in part one of this chapter, we were talking about really industrialization from the top down. This is going to look at the impact on the worker and how things sort of changed American society in terms of the workforce and labor and that sort of thing. You're going to see that more and more people were employed in industry. Where they are hourly workers rather than working on farms. We're going to get the emergence of a big middle class. We're also going to see um, that the number of service jobs go up. So people who are in the service industry, people who are in manufacturing and industrial work are both going up, whereas agriculture is going down. Also, more and more people are living in cities, and that's going to be in subsequent chapters, and fewer people are living on farms. Okay, so if you look at this right here, this is the Biltmore estate. It's one of many homes of the Vanderbilt family. This one is in, what is it, Asheville, North Carolina. This is just an example of the wealth that some of these, what they call robber barons at the top amassed. They just had elaborate parties, castles, um, trips. They did all of these different things. Excuse me, 10% of the richest people in the country at this time in 1890 controlled 90% of all of the wealth in the nation, as it says here in the first bullet point. And so there are just a lot of mansions that were created as a result of this, and a lot of opulence, at least for that 10% of the population. You're going to see, though, for the rest of the population, their standard of living did increase. Okay, there is a guy, Horatio Alder. He was an author and he wrote a lot of different books, like this one here, From Farm Boy to Senator, in which they were rags to riches story, very similar to Carnegie, Thomas Edison, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, a lot of these people, and you can name a lot of people in American history who went from rags to riches. It was possible here because of our economic and political system. The book and other, I don't know, social sciences of today are like, well, it's just a myth. I don't know. I'm more optimistic than that. I always believed that this sort of thing was true, and you still see it, in American society. Steve Jobs, I mean, they developed Apple Computer in his parents' garage. So those sorts of things do happen. But most wealthy people at this time, especially, were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASP, right? And they were from the middle class. If you were black, if you were Hispanic, if you were Italian or any of those, it was rare that you could achieve in American society at that time, just by sheer virtue of the numbers and then also the way that society structured and then the thought processes that people had in their own racist sort of Eurocentric beliefs that prevailed during that time period. But as I mentioned, you do see this growing middle class, a group of people, they're white collar jobs. So at the factories, you're going to need management. You're going to need people who are accountants. You're going to have people who deal with their supplies, inventory, transportation, hiring, firing, that sort of thing. But not only that, now you've got all these, department stores and everything else. I chose to put that picture here. This is a department store. There are people behind the counter who are assisting, and then there are those going to shop. So this created jobs as well. So now, as society is changing and it's evolving, there's more opportunities for other people to have different types of jobs. So it's not just on the farm, it's not just in the factory, but it's elsewhere. Right, plus you're going to need doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, that sort of thing. Okay, so this chart here, it shows this starts out in like 1840, and you can see agriculture drops significantly. That's what most people were involved in prior to the Civil War. But then after the Civil War, we're going to get the growth of industry. Industry is going to decline after World War II, and service industry continued to grow. And most people in the United States work in service industry today, like being a teacher, a lawyer, a salesperson, an accountant. Those sorts of things. We've talked about this in geography class. We also talked about it in government class, so this shouldn't be new to you. But if you look at 1900, it used to be that most people worked on farm, but by 1900, 2/3 of the entire population were wage earners. And most of those people worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. So they were trying to cut their hours. Some people worked more than that, right? So they were trying to get their hours cut. Very few worked less than that. And it's not going to be for a while until we get an 8-hour workday. Wages were determined by supply and demand. If you have a small labor force and you want to try to attract the people to your job, you're going to have to pay them more. But because there were more and more immigrants that kept coming into the country, that kept wages pretty low. Regardless of that, though, it's still the standard of living was high here in the United States compared to what it was. So this guy right here, David Ricardo, he was a British economist, and he argued that the iron law wages needed to stay because they'd only increase if wage earners could cause wages to fall and then cast some people into poverty. It doesn't make much sense, but he argued by that way then you wouldn't get this whole big influx of immigrants coming into the country who would compete for these jobs because they'd only be filled by certain people. So anyway, wages did remain low, and oftentimes in many families, the woman had to work, and a lot of times the children would go to work too, but that wasn't anything new. That had always been the case, and children had always worked on the farms, and now they would have to work to contribute to the income of the family. So women go out to work. Oftentimes, though, they're in jobs that were seen as an extension of the woman's role. So they might work in a textile mill, making clothes and that sort of thing. But by 1900, 1 in every 5 women worked. So 20% of them did. Most of them were young and unmarried. Only about 5% were married. And middle class women did not work. They shopped. They got involved in civic activity, and as you're going to see, they're the ones that are really leading the charge in the progressive movement and for reform as well. So as I said, they entered into these industries that were seen as an extension of a woman's role, doing that, such as textiles. But women kind of liked being out there. They were independent. They had jobs also as like telephone operators or secretaries or something like that. If they were in the professions, and it was rare, typically they got paid less than men, and that's something that women are trying to address today. One thing too that was different about women is that they were seen in public places. It used to be with this cult of domesticity back before this time period. Women were in the home, and that's where their role was, and so there was no reason to go out. Everything that they needed was produced right there in the home. I want you to look at this advertisement too. These are women. There was something called the Gilmore Girl. So a certain caricature of how sort of a woman should be at this time. So they're already playing into that idea, if I buy this, I'll look this way. I need to act that way. So this is going to continue with models and the quote unquote perfect woman and sort of this ideal embodiment of what the American woman was supposed to look like and be like. And that's going to be through modern advertising that emerged at this time. All right, but what we see is that people aren't content with this. People are upset at the fact that they're working long hours, difficult, dangerous jobs, and getting very, very little pay for that. So it used to be too that there was some gratification in what you did. You had a skill and you produced something, or you're on the farm and you're growing something. But now it's very impersonal. You're doing these mundane tasks. Oftentimes you don't know who your boss is. There's no interpersonal relationship. You don't have a stake in creating something that you could be proud of. It's, as I said, oftentimes very, very dangerous, right? So we get this turnover rate, people dropping out of industrial workforce. I don't know if they're going west and trying to do that sort of thing, but typically they'll just move from one industry to another and experience the same thing, long hours and low pay. And so we start to see some criticism against this. This is a very famous image. You can see holding up these protectors of industry. This is Puck, these fat people. I think that Vanderbilt is up there, and Gould and Cyrus Field. These people are all bloated, and they call them parasites, sitting on these bags of millions, whereas the worker is holding them up. I'm not quite sure what this raft sort of thing is supposed to be, but you can see too, there's kind of the sickle and sheath sort of image in the water there. So some people are fearful that they're going to start to emerge is socialism and communism and that sort of thing. So uprising of these anarchists in American society, there's fear of that. And this is an 1883 cartoon. Here's another cartoon. This is comparing feudalism to modern day. At this time, 1889 was modern. Barons of the feudal era with barons of the Industrial Revolution. So at the top little insert up there, you could see lords, barons, kings, whatever, from the feudal system who controlled things. And then the peasants would have to pay them some sort of I don't know, amount of money, taxes, food, whatever, to live on the land. And then they show that, well, this is kind of the same thing today, only these robber barons are the rich industrialists, and then the workers are the ones that have to pay them with their hard labor and their efforts, or the consumers in buying those products. All right, so what we start to see as a result of this and this change of mindset is that labor really starts to organize and unionize. They're not very successful though. And one of the reasons for that at this time, employers were using different tactics to prevent unions from forming. If it looked as if there was going to be a union forming at your plant, then you would just lock everybody out, shut your doors and not allow them to go on strike. If they want to go strike, who cares? We're going to hire scabs, so people to come in and work instead of them. And that was quite effective. What could you do? And then what these titans of industry would do too is they would let each other know, hey, this guy's a troublemaker. He's trying to unionize, and so your name would be blacklisted, and you wouldn't get hired for a certain job. So because your name would be circulated around. Also, if you were going to be hired, then maybe you would have to sign a yellow dog contract. This established your condition of employment. You had to swear that you would not join a union. Also, these companies hired private guards, such as the Pinkertons. Pinkertons is still around today. They have armored cars. They move money from point A to point B. They're a detective agency too. Carnegie hired the Pinkertons, and they're the ones that put down the strike at the Homestead strike at his plant in Pennsylvania. Also, the government worked hand in hand with business at this time. If a strike happened or if something, I don't know, prevented companies from running as which was their job and what they wanted to do, then oftentimes the government would send in troops to stop a strike, or the judges courts could issue an injunction which would end a strike. But anyway, for many Americans, they saw unions as like anarchical, troublemakers, socialists, violent, communist people. So it took a long time for unions to kind of catch on here in the United States. So in 1877, we're going to get the Great Railroad Strike, and this came as a result of the Panic of 1873, which I told you was at the time the greatest depression that our nation had experienced. So the railroad was losing money. A lot of them went bankrupt, and so what some of the railroads did, it started with Baltimore and Ohio, is they lowered wages, right? So this happened there. And so at the time, there was a railroad union that had come together. So all the railroad workers in all the locations, they stopped working. They all went on strike. And railroads were vandalized. They blew up bridges. They did all sorts of things Governors in all these states called out the militia. They're all in all, there were about 500,000 strikers at this time, and 100 people were killed in violence that took place as a result of this. President Hayes sent in federal troops to bring or to end the violence in many locations here. That this was probably, well, this was the worst strike that had occurred in the nation at that time, or I think even since. So anyway, prior to that, we're going to get, excuse me, I put these out of order. We did get there were efforts to try to unionize, and this was the first one. The problem with these first attempts to unionize is that they were very, very political. They had this broad spectrum of things that they wanted to achieve, and it was nearly impossible. So we get this National Labor Union, and they formed right after the Civil War from 1866 to 1872, and they tried to bring together skilled, unskilled. They wanted a shorter work day. They wanted better pay. They wanted better working conditions. They allowed women in. They allowed minorities in. Anybody could be part of this, right? But still, if you're working and you go on strike, they could just hire somebody who's not in the union. Eventually, a work day would be achieved under the Grant administration. He was going to do this through executive order, and that's going to be in 1869, but that's only for federal employees. What happened to them, though, because of the Panic of 1873, they had no leverage whatsoever. So they disappeared as a result of the Panic of 1873. Thus, they just go up until like 1872, and then they just disbanded. All 640 members just went away. But then we're going to get the Knights of Labor. So the Knights of Labor had formed, and they were able to survive through the Panic of 1873. So they were a secret organization. It was started by Terence Powderly, and what they wanted were some of the same thing. They wanted worker cooperatives. So basically, you form these groups of skilled things if you work in the railroad, or if you work in the steel industry, or you work in whatever industry, you're kind of like a cooperative working together. They wanted to abolish child labor, and they wanted to get rid of the trusts and the monopolies. Again, all people, skilled, unskilled, minorities, women, everybody. They were very, very political. Like the National Labor Party, the Knights of Labor grew to be very large, 730,000 people. But what's going to bring them down is the Haymarket bombing. So this talks about that. Notice on the right, this is in English, this poster, and it's also in German, Achtung Arbeiter. They're going to have a mass meeting, right? So this was in Chicago at Haymarket Square. This was near the McCormick Harvester plant. So it's right there. There was a dispute and a strike that was taking place, and there had been a lot of violence that had been going on throughout. People have been striking and that sort of thing. And then they had a large labor force in Chicago. 80,000 people were in the Knights of Labor. And then one day, they're giving all of these speeches. There's anarchists and everyone else. And then the police were sent in to kind of break everything up. And then somebody set off a bomb. Nobody knows who did it. But it killed 7 policemen and injured others. So the person who threw the bomb was never identified, but 4 anarchists were hanged. They didn't even know if they were guilty or not. Most likely they were innocent. Finally, the governor of Illinois steps in. He pardons 3 other people who were there before they could be hanged. But everybody was looking at this with terror and very, very afraid of where this was leading the United States. And so they were worried about it. And so this brought about the demise of the Knights of Labor Party. But we do get the rise of the American Federation of Labor, and this is still in place today. The man who did it, a very bright man, Samuel Gompers, he was their president until 1924. And what he didn't have a beef with capitalism. He thought it was good for the worker. And his idea was, we're only going to have skilled people. We're not going to get political. We are just going to work with businesses to try to improve the situation of the worker. So we work hand in hand together to improve the industry. So what they wanted better pay, and they wanted better working conditions, and they're only skilled. So if these people go on strike, then what are you going to do? It's going to be hard to find somebody who has their skill. So they had sort of like social class leverage. These guys were elevated over those who were skilled and unskilled. Right, so it was very effective, and so their membership grew very rapidly. They had 1 million people by 1901. Right, so they grew, and as I said, they're still around today. All right, so strike breaking in the 1890s, there were quite a few strikes. There were 2 massive strikes in the 90s, and it demonstrated this growing discontent among the workers, and that's going to help to bring about the progressive era in the next century. All right, so the Homestead strike we're going to talk about in class. We'll watch this video, but notice it's 1892. At this time, Carnegie Steel Plant, it's in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Carnegie's out of town. As a matter of fact, he might even be out of the country. He might be in Scotland. But it was planned. Henry Clay Frick, his manager, cut the wages for the workers by 20%, and then they went on strike. Well, they were locked out. They weren't allowed to come in, and then the Pinkerton Detective Agency was brought in to keep the peace. Well, there was a fight that broke out between the Pinkertons and the strikers when the scabs were trying to be brought in. And so these people all rioted. The townspeople came in to support the strikers, and the Pinkertons were left on their own. About 12 people were killed. There's a picture here of the National Guard who were brought in to bring down this violence. And then, maybe the sympathy was on the side of the strikers, but one of the strikers tried to kill Frick. He actually shot him or stabbed him, I can't remember. He attempted to kill him. And as a result of that, people thought, well, this is too much, So sympathy was on the side of business and not on the side of strikers. So it didn't work in their favor here. And then, as I told you, there was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And the person who was in charge of the railroad union, the president, was Eugene Debs. He founded the union. He had worked for a long time on the railroad, but he ran for president eventually 5 times as a socialist candidate, 1 time from jail. What he did, he wanted to incorporate different policies of unionizing within the railroad industry nationwide, right? Not just within a different business, but with all workers in all railroad companies across the country. And so what they do is they get all these affiliated chapters in there with him as the president. So that brings us to the railroad or the Pullman car strike. This is in the Railman Car Company, which was founded in 1867. This is an interesting company. It was the Pullman formed this in Chicago, and what they made were sleeper cars and luxury cars. Look at this railroad car in the top right. Also, the one thing Pullman did is he had a company town, and this is pictured down below on the bottom picture. It still exists in Chicago. It's on the south side, and what they're doing right now is they're going through and they're renovating all these the factory, the houses, the office buildings, all of that, and making them places to live for people in Chicago. But at the time, there were 1,000 houses, and they all had electricity and running water, parks, library, all sorts of amenities. But if you worked there, there was no bar, there were no public meetings or anything like that. They were fearful that you would, form a union or something like that. So people lived here in these houses, right? And let's see, it was known that they called it the largest hotel in the world because people slept on these trains. There were 26 million people a year who used these Pullman cars in the United States at that time. So anyway, people lived in the houses and they had to pay rent there. And then they worked in the plant during the day. But what happened in 1894 as a result of the panic of 1893, Pullman lowered the wages by 20%, but they didn't cut the rent on the houses. So the workers stopped production and they appealed to the American Railroad Union for help. So what they did, Eugene Debs directed that all those affiliates not work on any trains that were pulling Pullman cars. Right, so what this did is it just shut down rail traffic throughout the country at that time, and people were, they were, what are you going to do? They really had a lot of leverage at that time. But the one thing that was problematic is that the U.S. mail was not being carried. So what a judge did was he ordered that the mail be delivered and that the strike ended. So the labor leaders refused to abide by this injunction, but they were arrested. But that halted the strike at that time. So this is sort of an illustration right here showing Pullman's kind of squeezing the worker between lower wages and higher rent, and this is why they went on strike. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll see you in class. Thanks.